Now we're going to move to our therapists. So that was our ADHD coaches panel talking about how ADHD coaching helps with young people with ADHD. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Vic Patel, welcome, and Ruth Dines. I'm going to ask you to start your video. Perfect.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
I think that was my computer. Hello, Ruth. Hi, Vic. How are you?
Hey.
Hello. Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you probably, I think, Ruth, you heard a little bit about the coaching side of things, and we're really delighted to have you both here to discuss how, you work, with the coaches and kind of what you bring to ADHDers, how we work together, and why it's so important to be able to, for ADHDers to be able to access both, kind of coaching, CBT and DBT. So I thought I might just, get you guys to introduce yourselves first briefly. So Vic, would you like to start off and let everyone know what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a consultant psychologist specializing in the framework of DBT. And for obviously there's so much research out there, but if I was to give like a sentence on DBT, it's more just to do with creating a kind of neuroplasticity and learning to kind of that classic be good at feeling, not feel better, so to speak. So kind of that classic neurohacking, but also helping ADHDers work with interpersonal kind of high levels of rejection dysphoria. So the interpersonal effectiveness could lend itself well to relating. So again, there's two phases: be good at feeling, not feel better, but also be good at relating to obviously increase connections, oxytocin, and reduce loneliness.
Yeah, so important, isn't it? I love what you said there, Vic, about, be good at feeling versus feeling better, because ADHD we're notorious for always being fine. We have to be fine. And I think we've kind of talked about that a little bit before. So yeah, what you do, the DBT, and I guess you'll go into it in a bit more detail with some of the questions, but yeah, so important for ADHDers to learn those skills. And Ruth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me here, Stephanie. I am a therapist and I'm an integrative therapist, so I bring in various modalities into my practice, although my specialist one would be CBT. And I also teach CBT at college, where I'm a tutor in integrative counselling. And basically, I think as a broad brush, what I try to do in my room, which hopefully complements what coaches do, is to normalize what's going on for the client, to give them hope and agency so that they can actually be advocates for themselves and what they need, and to understand about the impact of ADHD on themselves and those around them. So ability to mentalize and see how they impact others. I think the key thing for me is to make them realize that actually, it is unique brain wiring, but in terms of it can be unique and it can just be different. To normalize that that's one way of seeing the world and all the strengths and skills that can also bring. So it's a holistic sort of approach.
Yeah, and we're finding that more so now too, which is great with therapy. There is a bit of an integrative and a bit of coaching and that acceptance kind of model. And I think it's the same with, it'd be really interesting, I guess, for participants to hear kind of how more the CBT and the DBT kind of work together, and, just kind of the commonalities. But forgive me if I'm wrong, but would it be as well with CBT, it's kind of working out what your narrative is as well, and being able to kind of maybe shift that ways of thinking, and then DBT's kind of got different skills in terms of I don't know, how does it, it'd be great to find out a little bit more about how the two work together.
I think it's all underpinned based on the behavioral science in regards to, changing the way you think and maybe change the way you kind of feel and behaving differently. But in the DBT lens, it kind of works specifically on that neuroscience obviously there's different types of different treatments, exactly what Ruth said in regards to the whole goal is to optimize an individual's well-being, you know? But mainly in DBT, for at least my opinion, is that lens of neuroscience. Learning to understand the biochemistry, learn to acknowledge the concepts of the maladaptive behaviors we use, overcompensating, fixing, were useful, but not so much now. We've got to upgrade that nervous system. Not to say anyone's coping mechanism is awful, bad. They're just not effective now to upgrade your nervous system. Yeah. So DBT, as you know, is conceptualized with 4 modules. So the premise of mindfulness, as you know, there's a lot of research out there. Just even naming an emotion or naming a thought helps reduce brain activity. Yeah. So that once it reduces brain activity, you're more likely then to maybe use the exchange skills, which is quick emotion check. Is what I'm feeling justified? So what we mean by that is each emotion someone feels is a legitimate experience. No one's invalidating that. Yeah, it is a legitimate inner world that is happening, but we've got to choose our responses that fits the situation today. Yeah, and you may use that through certain skill sets of checking the fact, one skill being in emotion regulation. So checking the fact doesn't have to necessarily be cognition, but it just it helps us change. Is my envy justified right now? And if so, what's my urge?
Okay, what do you mean by what's my urge? Is my
So for example, caring and despairing, high levels of perfectionism, maybe come out in terms of maybe my interpersonal relationships like bitterness, contemptuousness, things that kind of the ADHD brain may not lend itself to relating because of the high levels of reduction dysphoria as an example. So the brain is compromised, the critical thinking is not accessible. So the limbic, the high executive functioning has been shut off. So what we're trying to do is deactivate the threat, so we're more likely to choose response over reaction.
Right, and these are actual skills, isn't it? That in DBT you're teaching actual skills to be able to, and so I guess with Ruth, in terms of the therapy, is this kind of like more of the kind of a precursor to that cognitive process that you be interesting just to hear.
I think what I may be presumptuous, I think what Vic and I do is very similar, but every therapist will put their own lens through depending on what the client needs and the client's perceptions. I think what is probably mirroring a lot of what Vic said is, when I get a client in my room and I deal with adults, so I'm dealing with adults who have ADHD and could have just been diagnosed at 40, 50, 60 years of age, or I've got adults who are dealing with kids or siblings who've got ADHD and what's been the impact on them for that, their parenting skills or them growing up with a sibling who was difficult. So for me, what I look at first of all is how we ground the client, how we give them the skills to actually calm the limbic system, because often it's very, very hyper active. So it would be about grounding skills and different ways to help them calm the limbic system and their thinking. And one of the ways that we calm their thinking is to look at what we call, as Vic's mentioned, the cognitive distortions. So it's not the situation that happens to individuals, it's their perception of it that causes their thinking to become distorted, which then affects how they feel, which then affects how they behave. That's sort of the ABC of the CBT for me. Thoughts affect feelings, which affect behavior, and it goes into a loop. So the more that you end up behaving a certain way, you're going to feel another way and then think. So you're reinforcing that negative loop. And of course, as David said, we've all got a negative bias. That's what's made us survive as a species. But for some people, it's hyper alert, like a light going off much more quickly. So what I do is we look at grounding exercises, calming, and then we look at the thinking patterns which affect their ultimate behavior. And it's making clients realize that actually their thinking, because they've done it their whole life, seems normal to them or realistic. But actually, it's often when we do the scoring with like shoulds, musts, and oughts, or blaming or personalization, all your classic cognitive distortions, they realize that they're scoring very highly on these. And that's when we start to work with them to make them realize there may be a different way of thinking. which will mean a different way of reacting, to then behave in a way that's actually more realistic. As Vic said, you know, with this type of thinking, and especially with ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions, the prefrontal cortex is not actually as developed as in other people often, or it goes offline much more quickly. And it's the emotional regulation that we want to bring in to help them with that. So that hopefully makes sense.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, Vic, it sounds similar. You know, obviously DBT comes with its specific skills. I guess it's broken into those 4 different modules. It's yeah, so it's a different type, but it's similar, doing the similar thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's very much based on that. And we take it exactly what just Ruth said, but more functioning than when Ruth said about emotion reg. So the key component of Marshall Linehan's DBT model is that emotion regulation, learning to identify, name an emotion, because all 10 emotions are very justified, warranted, and needed in many ways. And, you know, we have this kind of myth of if changing thinking worked, we would have done it by now. So that's kind of the whole idea of trying to learn to create what Ruth was saying, kind of more effective ways of upgrading the nervous system that creates neuroplasticity and neuroflexibility, you know, because the goal for the individual is to learn to better one's life and find a mission, you know, and that's kind of like the mission might be different values we hold as an individual, you know?
Yeah. And if I can come in there, Vic, I mean, Vic's ahead of me in a sense, if we look at it, because I mean, when I teach CBT, what we say is that like DBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, this is the 3rd wave of CBT, which is great because it brings in all the other ways that we can actually have a holistic approach to treating this. So when it started, CBT was, as it sounds, cognitive. Now, what Vic works with is the next stage, which is great. It's the add-ons to look at the mindfulness and the acceptance and all the other holistic ways that we can calm the body as well as the brain. I hope that's okay, Vic, that cinches with what you...
100%, you know, and the difference between the C and the D of DBT, CBT is exactly that in terms of what Ruth's talking about is more like you're more recent 3rd wave research than I guess the traditional Beck's model, you know, and the whole idea of the D is that we can hold both. Both opposing truths can be true at any given time. Yeah, so it's about how one can learn to hold that internally in their frame of reference, but also relate, as what Ruth said about that mentalization, holding both, what's understanding for me and how can I upgrade that system. And distress tolerance module is not just coping skills, it's very much around how you turn off the fret sensitivity, fret drive in practical, creative ways, so you're more likely to scoop. Yeah, the emotion that needs to be felt, named, regulated.
That's a hard, yeah. And for ADHD, it's that distress tolerance, I think, that is really key for us, particularly if we've kind of, one of our coping strategies has been disassociation. You know, like emotions, you know, they just get in the way. I need to just, you know, do this thing. So I'm just going to be fine, not feel these things.
Correct.
But then you just find that you're not able to cope very well, and that you might explode. And ADHD is not being able to assert themselves because they come off too aggressive and because they can't regulate themselves when they're trying to get their needs met. So yeah, does what you guys do, so obviously in terms of helping ADHDers manage emotions so that they can also communicate in a way that doesn't sometimes, because that's one of the big problems with ADHD is why they don't kind of usually speak up, because they often will be accused of, you know, being coming across as too aggressive.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the key thing for me, I can't speak for you, Vic, is that psychoeducation is so important. And I think that's the same for the coaches, is that clients understand why they're like this, because by understanding, they stop the self-criticism, the self-blame, and they've got a better barrier to other people saying it's your fault, it's your problem. So by doing that, we can increase self-esteem and we increase agency. So it's that buffer and barrier that actually I'm not disruptive, I'm not badly behaved. This is not who I am in the world. It's a part of me. So it's a psychoeducation so important in so many ways, and for the parents, so that they realize
Yeah.
it's not their fault or bad parenting.
Yeah, because there's a lot of guilt and shame. And actually, I was interesting, I think, Vic, when you talk about the different emotions in DBT, there is guilt and shame, isn't there? I think you were saying. And that for us ADHD is like guilt and shame's like bad, bad, bad. And I remember when you said, it's good, it's good. It's just such a different way of thinking about it. But yeah, how come DBT takes that approach, and how does it help ADHDers with those emotions in particular?
I think exactly what Ruth said. I think if we understand someone's kind of, if you want to call it, formulation story, understanding why there is a development of those ways of thinking, behaving, coping mechanisms, one's more likely to learn to create an adaptive response, because it's not about just regulating the nervous system in the individual self, but a nervous system they want to subscribe to themselves in the life they want to live. So the whole idea of Hans model is a live life and live life well, and so what DBT does for ADHD is exactly that, is first develop a little care plan, understand what are the current targets, what we would call in DBT are certain behaviors I want to reduce and stop. And it doesn't have to be private things we do, like perfectionism, control, like other problematic behaviors. But what it does do, it also addresses social signaling issues too. What kind of keeps somebody out of the tribe? Yeah. So if there's a fly on the wall, what will that relationship person see? Like keeps you disconnected, lonely in your own world. And they're the targets we target. Then there's a diary card, and each week skills will just be added on by starting to track the behaviors. So it's not about stopping your behavior. Let's increase a new set. The old ones will die down over time. Yeah. So that's kind of what the model is learn a skill. So it's very didactic first. Then once someone has got a good skill set, then we process maybe specific memories that might need an extra neurological hack for helping, especially with like EMDR, has a good evidence base as well for, specific issues may have happened historically that might have led to that high levels of rejection tolerance, as an example. So we process that memory with a skill set now.
Right. Yeah, because someone did ask, how does CBT, DBT interact with EFT and EMDR? Yeah, so how do those therapies interact with EFT and EMDR?
And I think the DBT principle, at least, I'm sure maybe Ruth can give some light in a minute, is we skill someone up to create that a capacity to self-soothe, because obviously some of these painful feelings, thoughts, historical experiences are insanely painful, and our brain does not know what is real imagined past. So therefore, the skill set helps to create a good, robust sense of self. So there's a level of mission. And then identifying the EMDR is learning to kind of break some of those neurological memories that have been stored. Remember, we're not changing the outcome of the past. We're just learning to create a neuroflexibility so the brain can store it. So again, comes back down to Ruth of understanding what happens with the threat system, the sympathetic nervous system, and how it has maintained the pattern.
Yeah, Ruth, was there anything you want to say in relation to EFT and EMDR?
Yeah, I think that it's a bit like a Venn diagram. If you put, here and me here, there'll be a lot in the middle. We do very similarly, right? And I think for me, what's absolutely fundamental working with any client, apart from the actual exercises to calm the limbic system, is connected to that, which is the self-soothing. Because a lot of my clients who've had ADHD or have it at the moment are very self-critical, and they blame themselves. And it's that critical voice, and it's part of one of the cognitive distortions that we really want to work with. Because, I have this great quote, and I actually pinched it from a really good book, so I wish it was mine, but it's not, which is, the person you speak to most in the world in your lifetime will be you. So make it kind and nice, and how you would speak to a friend or someone you love. But we don't. We turn it inwards. And often we turn it inwards because we've never been allowed to express anger or actually express hurt. So what we do if we can't express it is we turn it in, which can be the cloak of shame, it can be depression. So one of the things that can be so enlightening for clients is, first of all, to normalize how they are, stop the self-blaming, and learn how to soothe themselves. Because then what they can do is start from a level playing field of being in the world in a way where they can start to accept themselves, which is where Vic comes in, and look at these interventions and tools that will help them to change the things they can and accept what they can't. This is who they are. And it's that acceptance versus the change. That's obviously the cognitive dissonance, is what do I want to change and what do I want to accept? But it doesn't have to be either or. It can be actually both. I learn to change what I can and accept what I can't. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not easy though, is it, for ADHDers? So this is in ADHD coaching, quite often ADHDers will have these blind spots. Some of them will think that they set boundaries, that they won't be a problem, but actually it could be their biggest problem. A lot of ADHDers, they present quite confident and that they kind of know themselves really well. They know everything. I don't know if this is your experience as well, but then the more kind of work they do, the more they realize, hang on, I have been kind of constructing this narrative or not been, looking at these things. So, I mean, coaching really kind of helps with that. But where we tend to send, like, we really see the difference between people that have received therapy, ADHDs that have received therapy and those that haven't yet. And, definitely we've found those that have received therapy are able to challenge some of their beliefs themselves and are able to kind of regulate themselves more easily. But quite often, if we get an ADHD that we want to coach and move forward, because coaching is more about, moving forward, we don't really look backwards. So we only look backwards when it comes to, maybe looking at things that they've done, achievements, because again, ADHDs forget what they do. So, they don't celebrate and they don't kind of, remember and store and look at, these are the things I'm good at. So they kind of don't have that benefit to help them, increase their self-esteem. So we look back to kind of unearth the buried treasure, or we look back to see, well, what worked for you in the past on something. But otherwise, we're very much about moving forward. And I guess with therapy, I'm not sure, probably not DBT, right? More CBT in terms of other things like PTSD, which is really common with ADHD. Like, so Ruth, would you say that you deal, and help people with PTSD?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I want to say is a lot of what comes up for people with ADHD, the rest of the population also has. This is not them alone in a sense of why me. It's actually other people struggle with this, but because of ADHD and how it plays out, it can be much more difficult or more complex. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my approach is not just CBT. So if I see a client, it will be integrative. So I start often with the psychodynamic approach, which is, let's look at your childhood. Because childhood is where we learn how to be in the world. It's where we have our attachment and our attunement. And if we don't have good attachment to our parents, or we don't get an attuned parent, then we start to have problems anyway. So I do start with childhood, because if we've got ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, that is going to impact. But it's also difficult. Do we have adverse childhood experiences because we've got ADHD or the neurodiverse conditions, or is it that's caused that? It's chicken and egg. Either way, I think understanding one's childhood and our attachment style, yeah, and our relationship with siblings and our caregivers and school, I think that gives a good start to understand our way of being in the world and why things might be like they are. And the other big thing actually is what I see in my room is a lot of adults who've been diagnosed with ADHD. What we have to start with is also the loss and regret. There's a lot of very angry, resentful, adults I have, because they say this part of my life I never had, or this was lost to me, or things could have been so different. And so what we have to work with is to process that loss and that anger, so we can get them to a place where they can actually start to work on what can be different. Past doesn't have to dictate the future. We can't change the past, we can't, but we can reframe it in a sense of what can be different. And that gives them that hope and that agency that things can change for them.
Yeah. Vic, how does that work with the, DBT? Is that kind of work that's kind of expected, that's done kind of separately, isn't it? How does...
Yeah, so I guess everyone, like you said, does things differently. So if I have let's say someone seeing me, I would obviously, as what Ruth said, understand some form of story. Now, what we first work on is the what and the how first. So again, similar to Ruth, but maybe kind of come from a different lens. So we first look at what we need to do and how we need to do life first. Yeah. And then once we've done a what and the how to do life, so that might be reducing some of my quality of life interfering behaviors that gets in the way of optimization, then we lean backwards and exactly what Ruth said, allocate certain time to now start picking and piecing things together. Because often there will be secondary emotions. Yeah. So for example, anger may be just a masking of something that is feelings of anxiety or shame or own sadness. So, so through the emotional regulation, we're able to look at what I need to do and how I need to do first. And then many people tend to be like, no, I feel like that's fantastic now. I feel more empowered, a lot of kind of autonomy now, and I'm owning my life. Whereas some people might want to think, okay, do you know what? I need to now look at specific things of where this originated from, and a little lens on that might be worth it as well. So again, it's exactly what Ruth said, but in a way in which the DBT first is what you need to do and how you need to do life.
Yeah, a bit more of a coaching kind of approach, sounds like.
Yeah, I think for me, I don't know about you, Vic, but lots of it is client-led with the therapy. I think that's where it differs slightly maybe to the coaching. They complement each other, but the therapy is a lot more client-led. Why are you here? Well, how can I help you? What brings you to counselling at this point? What needs to be different for your life to be better? What would make your life better? So it's those open questions at the start so that we know what the client wants. What do you want from counselling? And the key one for me is in 6 months' time, if you left and you said, Ruth's fab, what would have changed in your life to make you feel like this? So I think it's client-led, and we stand back a bit, whereas I think within the coaching, it's much more collaborative and it's much more maybe directive at times.
Yeah.
So I think, but they both, the coaching and the therapy can really be a holistic way to hold that person from slightly different angles.
That's interesting, actually. It's an interesting point, because I think coaching more so we're also very client-led. So we believe that, the client's not broken. They're the expert in their own lives and they bring the agenda. So kind of each session, when we do a coaching session, they bring kind of whatever it is that's kind of on their mind. And we try and reach an agreement as to kind of what they want to walk away with at the end of the session, and kind of coach them, get them to come up with actions and help hold them accountable, but do it all through an ADHD lens. But same, like what you were saying, Ruth, using kind of open-ended questions, not leading. So like the ICF approach, the International Coaching Federation, not allowed to lead. And that's why with coaching, it's important that coaches, you get a certified coach that is, able to kind of follow those competencies, because, coaching is unregulated. So, so long as you're following the ICF approach, you're not going to do any harm, because it's all about just helping that client get clear. I mean, we use the lens, but that ADHD lens, so we understand where the obstacles are, but it just means that we can ask the right questions for them to get there themselves, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's funny, because I think a lot of coaches would have a view that more therapy is kind of directive, or maybe that's the old style, and obviously like what Vic does, Vic's teaching skills, and that obviously is a lot more directive, that's more kind of direct. But I guess with the therapy that you do, Ruth, as you said, it's kind of it's not just strict kind of CBT style exercises and things like that. It's a different approach.
Yeah, and I think I don't know what Vic thinks, but I think it also depends on the client. You know, I'll be honest with you, there are times when I am more directive, and there's times when I will challenge. And I think it depends on the client. I think the most important thing is that you build the relationship with the client so that they feel supported and held and they can trust you. Once you have that, then I feel I'm able sometimes to gently challenge or to gently lead.
Mm.
So I do that myself. I don't know about you, Vic, and but
The
yeah.
same. And I think definitely, as you said, I think, I would offer it to the person I'm speaking to, like, how would you like me to kind of like tune up? Because I could be completely radical. If there was I'm quite indecisive of making a choice of something. Great, I'll help you make a choice with the skill in mind. Let's put it through a lens and let the wise mind decide in terms of the values, intuition. Whereas, yeah, some people might say to me, Vic, can you just stop speaking for a while and let's give up on skills? And I just want to just digest something, which is also equally where it needs to be. So I think it comes back down to exactly, Ruth, that word you mentioned of helping someone give a voice to their own story and owning it, and kind of, which is fantastic, especially in the world we live in, or the world those behaviors were developed, now can be quite an owning and becoming experience, which is so fantastic.
Mm. And I think linked to that, what's really powerful, and Irving Yalom has a wonderful chapter in his book on this about taking responsibility. And I think one of the things for me is that it's like letting clients learn how to take responsibility for the things they can change, the things that they can own. Because when we take responsibility for what we can own, we can let everything else go. It's not out of our control. It's not our responsibility. And I remember once I said to a client who I'd worked with for 6 months and we had a really good relationship. And I turned around to him and I said, you know what? I'll call him Fred. I said, Fred, I'm going to save you a lot of money in therapy. Because until you get off your arse and you start taking responsibility, nothing's going to change. And I have to tell you, he left me 3 months later and he had turned his life around remarkably. Now, I'm not saying that's because of me, but I'm saying sometimes we have to challenge and tell clients to take responsibility.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. It's interesting, and you've probably seen this with some ADHDers. Sometimes ADHDers, they take too much responsibility, take responsibility for everyone else too. And, these ADHDers that can see that any act that they take, decisions, and the impact it's going to have on other people. And, they just take away all the responsibility, and it kind of paralyzes them. What do you do in that scenario? What would in terms of therapy?
I think it would kind of
Go on,
what
you
the
go, Vic.
secondary game would be. So to first look at this intolerance of discomfort, intolerance of uncertainty. Obviously, there's a fusion going on there. So I probably would look at a recent example on what basically was an underlying, not reason, but a function this behavior serves. Because each behavior has a function. Now, that function has a really effective one, because people like ADHDers get stuff done in terms of high levels or high standard. But sometimes then the crash at the end is crashing, but also not knowing how to have fun. So I probably would want to know what the function of that behavior is. And in DBT, we call it a chain analysis. So to understand that behavior, we want to understand a 24-hour period of where that behavior developed, as if it's a scene, and look at what skill set might have been useful to now start creating a future template on now what I could do effectively, not well, but just effectively. So keeping the mind on the mission, the value system, and how am I going to flexibly do this? And often not, that's where all the 4 modules come into play and weaved in. So I would like to understand the function behind that behavior and to realize it's okay to be perfectionistic, be kind to it, but also be prepared to learn. What might feel awkward or failing, but as it just learning. Do you know?
Yeah, so kind of lean into the discomfort. But yeah, when you talk, it translates into coaching speak, keep your eye on your why, and leaning into the discomfort zone, because these things feel uncomfortable for ADHD. It's like these new, because they're breaking things that they're very much held on to, their safety. It's a safety zone, even though it doesn't serve them. Maybe they haven't kind of paused to get perspective and made the link, the pattern. Yeah, this thing, I've really got to break it, and I guess that's the first step for them, is being able to kind of pause and get clear, know what they're actually doing, which we found in coaching quite often, just through kind of reflecting, mirroring. Sometimes for the first time, they realize, oh, hang on, that's not what I think, or that's obviously not what I do, So it's quite interesting. That's the first step, isn't it? That insight and awareness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So in terms of, someone's asked about anger. So now this is another huge issue. And you said something before, Vic, around quite often anger, that's not the kind of underlying, or the first emotion. There's other things and then the anger comes. So with ADHD in particular, this person wanted to ask, where does the anger come from? And do you work with this kind of, with anger issues, particularly with ADHDs?
Yeah, like that's kind of anger is a very functional emotion. Yeah. So to understand the origins of anger, why we have anger, but also there's a huge lens under that of unmet needs, grieving for unmet expectations or outcomes of that individual. It could be feelings of shame, feelings of judgment, guilt, some anxiety there, or fear of losing control, which means to give up the control, the engineering part. Frustration too, again, ADHD, but it's not a death sentence. It's an identity. It is part and parcel of the way the brain, or my ADHD brain, would work. So therefore, again, what Ruth said is that kind of level of increasing compassion, level of acknowledging, how am I going to learn to be kind to it, but learn to express my anger in more effective, dynamic ways. But also for a young ADHDer, it comes from a place of feelings of unknown, a quantity of uncertainty, and often don't know how to express it other than just get rid of it somehow. But often that current puts more shame and guilt. So then wants to withdraw the whole pattern again. Yeah. And then especially that heightened level rejection dysphoria comes in, and that just becomes another lens. So definitely anger in the DBT lens can be managed through distress tolerance, the classic ice cube. We've seen it in the media of the ice baths or the facing cold water. Marshall Anahan talks about it as the tip skill, change temperature. So you're more likely to then know what the emotion of anger is, to regulate it, express it. So there's more healthy boundaries that come into play. Yeah, it's another level.
So I was going to make a joke. We shouldn't be throwing ice buckets over our children.
Yes.
With it. Yeah. No, parents, do not try that. That will backfire quite badly. Sorry. I have been tempted at times, but no. Yeah, but but you mean like kind of holding an ice cube, like I know that they're holding temperature kind of.
Yeah, correct. Actually, anger, fear is often the hot emotions, or shame, anything that's hot. Now, in order for us to be good at feeling, we need to learn to tolerate discomfort, tolerate the emotion, because the emotion is not the problem. Anger's not the problem. It's the urge that often gets in the way. Yeah, or what Ruth was saying before, the appraisal of an event that often can get in the way. Now, if that appraisal is too rigid or fixed, there is going to be the same thing again. So there needs to be some neuroflexibility, neuroadaptability. So one way is called the tip. So Marsha talks about putting your face in cold water, ice cubes, so that the temperature comes down, not the emotion. So people assume doing these skills, the emotion goes. That's not the ethos. Yeah. So you're able to deactivate that threat system. So you're able to access that critical thinking, the executive functioning that can access problem solving. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
That is where I would come in to get that distress tolerance down through anger. And then actually, really, is it anger, or is there another emotion here? So it gives someone the accessibility on the mind to choose a response, not a reaction.
Right. Yeah. So Ruth, so what do you tend to do as well? Yeah. So with an ADHD that is presenting with the anger management issues.
To be honest, I think Vic said it brilliantly. I mean, he said everything I was going to say. So thanks for that, Vic.
Yeah.
I think just in summary, as Vic said, anger is a really important positive emotion. We don't want to take that away. What we want to do is teach the clients how to manage it and express it in a way that won't get them into more trouble. And again, as Vic said, anger is a secondary emotion. What's underneath it? It's often hurt, rejection. There's history here. Anger can be a muscle memory of something that's gone on before, and that's your go-to reaction. So I think, again, it's working with what we call the window of tolerance. If someone gets very angry very quickly, then we want to widen that window of tolerance for them to be able to handle more difficult emotions. Most of us will run a mile from feeling something that's difficult, from discomfort. What we've got to learn to do, it's the same with anxiety, is learn to let the feeling in. The more we run from it and the more we avoid it, the more it will come back and hijack us. So what I want to teach the clients, the same as Vic, is how do we handle a range of difficult emotions? And how do we hold a range of emotions in one situation? So I think it's really what Vic said for me. It's the same. The window of tolerance widens, allowing, normalizing anger. What's the frustration here? And what's the better way to be able to express and assert that so we get our needs met?
Yeah.
Especially in intention, the inattentiveness of the ADHD's brain, right? Or the lack of, or the excessive part. So the frustration could be because of, I know I'm capable and I have a capacity to do it, but often what gets in the way is well, how do I do it? So that's where the therapy may come into, where is, well, you know what to do, but it's just now, how do we do it in a way that doesn't compromise relationships, sense of self, which then helps the individual feel like empowered with a choice.
And how, so one thing, with coaching as well, we kind of do similar things, but obviously not to that level. We're not emotional regulation experts. And as I said, with the coaching, it is very much, the client's agenda, and maybe we just help them get clarity. So maybe we get them to, talk through a situation where something's happened, just so they've got kind of more awareness. But obviously, if there is a issue there, we kind of refer back to the therapist. Or what's really helpful for the coach is if they're, working with a therapist, and, we also work with that therapist too, and discuss what's going on, in coaching, what's being brought in coaching, what's being discussed in therapy. It's really helpful to be able to take that, two-pronged attack, in that, hang on, so what did you do in therapy? What were you supposed to be doing? So the coach can kind of keep the, client, in check as well, and hold accountable. But then also by giving them context. So maybe if it was helping as well, by the client kind of just talking it out, processing it. And then again, there's that momentum that David was talking about. There needs to be that kind of reward that, yes, this is actually worth, doing. Because, quite often, again, the ADHD are not really kind of pausing to process, to kind of see that they're making progress. So, it works very well. And we kind of do take twos as well. And we sometimes role play. So say there's, a conflict at home, right, with mom, or, even employees in the workplace, things like that, they're wanting to ask for something, role playing kind of how the conversation's going to go, that kind of rehearsal, they find really helpful too, particularly, and that's quite fun. I don't know if you guys do that, but I like to play the challenging, I'm the challenging mother, or the manager that's going to be really difficult to get around. And because that is the emotions will, be triggered in that role play. I mean, how does that kind of work with you guys? Like, do you do stuff like that too?
Yeah, I guess in the DBT terms, there's a skill called cope ahead. And that's kind of exactly that kind of in vivo exposure of a feared situation or a worrisome situation, and we kind of play out very intensively on from leaving, let's say, the house to the workplace as an example. And at any point, any visceral feelings, what can we do to create that kind of skill set? And again, it's that kind of living life skillfully. And I wonder if also there is kind of cognitive testing, I guess Ruth could explain, like behavioral experiments, to kind of create that cognitive flexibility. What do you think, Ruth?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think in a sense I do role plays as well. I'll pretend to be the difficult mother or sibling, and then we look at how it can be different in the room, the perception, what's going on, the response. I think, you know, psychoeducation is really important, but what I say is, and I, again, this was pinched from someone else, but it's all very well talking about what's going on and talking about what can be different, but it's only when we start to put it into practice that we start to change habits, and the chemicals in the brain start to change, as we know. And I always think about it as like a train track. If you keep doing the same thing, we get very good at what we do a lot of. So we need to stop doing the stuff that isn't helping us in our life. And we need to start a new groove of different thinking and different ways of being. But it's not until clients put it into practice that we will see change. It needs to become implicit and habit. And I call that, you know, if they don't do that, 50 minutes in the room with me is not enough. We'll have to start doing change outside of the room. Otherwise, it's cognition without ignition. They know it, but they're not changing it. So they're not going anywhere, to use David's analogy of a car. So I think what's really important is we do role plays, or we do actually do things creatively, or bring in things like the inner child. You know, clients who come to see me who say should, must, or ought a lot, should do this, they must have done that, they ought to have done this. That's rigid thinking. And that's where we need to start to see what's a different word, and why is the thinking rigid? And often the thinking's rigid because it protects us from a core belief of I'm not good enough. So the perfectionist that Vic talks about, perfectionist is a way of thinking which covers up a deep held belief of actually I'm only important or good or worthwhile if I do perfectly. So we have to work with the thought process, and then at some point we go deeper into what's the belief it's hiding or shielding that you don't want to realize. So what I call a perfectionist is the happiness thief, isn't it? Because nothing's ever good enough.
Yeah, which and Vic was saying RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, that's the kind of where the ADHD kind of lens comes into it, because, you know, Dr. Dodson, he talks about RSD, then obviously the ADHD is not feeling good enough. It's not just actual rejection, it's that kind of perceived rejection everywhere, always kind of assuming it's your fault or people are talking about you, or, you know, that, you know, it's just kind of wired. So he talks about it being wired into you. Actually, this is a good question to ask you guys. So rejection sensitive dysphoria, there's this belief that like ADHD, it's kind of wired. And Dr. Dodson says that it's not easily overcome by CBT, like therapy, because it's a wiring. So he talks, there's certain kind of medications that apparently helps. But yeah, what has been your, what has been your experience with ADHDs that you work with on this type of thing in terms of, you know, their self-worth, self-esteem when it comes to RSD?
I think it's, again...
Should I go first, Vic?
Go.
I think you're right. I mean, it is hardwired. It is, you know, it's definitely hardwired into the brain, these thoughts, these behaviors, you know. So there's no question that we need to look at the wiring. And CBT and talk therapy will only go so far, I'll be honest. I think with this type of feeling and somatic sense and somatic response, we have to work with the body too. I think for most things, especially trauma, I don't do CBT alone, and I sometimes will do very little CBT. That can come later, but you've got to learn to regulate the client somatically. And therefore, I think you have to look at the body and the mind. You can't separate them the two of them. Because what's going to happen is that your thinking goes offline, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, because our body, with our reptilian amygdala response, is going to overwhelm us. That is our fight, flight, and freeze that's going to come in. And you ain't going to be able to talk to someone when they're going through that response. You've got to work with calming the body to be able to bring them back into the head. So I think with things like this rejection dysphoria, you've got to work with the body and that, not just the hardwiring. That's just my
really
view.
helpful. That's definitely been kind of our experience as ADHD coaches as well. Vic,
Yeah,
RSD.
I think you're right. I think the way we would conceptualize RSD is high levels of shame, because rejection comes under the umbrella of shame, a level of high levels of, if I'm going to be rejected from the tribe. Yeah. So what we do is we educate individuals on the function, evolutionary, again, as the doctor mentioned before, hardwiring. These 10 emotions are hardwired, and so is shame. If shame goes back millions and billions of years old, of like the function of why we care about what people think of us, and we cannot not stop thinking. So what we tend to do is formulate shame, learn to work on creating that increased self-compassionate part of our mind of forgiveness. Yeah, because forgiveness can hopefully help with our own sense of self and relieve our own resentment, bitterness, but so that we're able to access the hormone called oxytocin. Now, the oxytocin hormone will help us deactivate the RSD part in a way that we're able to create oxytocin, so we're able to increase social connection and social bonds. Yeah. So rejection dysphoria will remain, but it doesn't have to dictate the way in which the individuals still function in the relationship, but learn to turn that threat system off quicker to create oxytocin for social bond, which helps reduce loneliness and low mood. Yeah. So definitely, it's all about that kind of neurohacking and constant neuroflexibility. So shame is beautiful. And that's why rejection is not a bad thing. It's just that the behaviors we do may not be effective. So we need to understand, what are we still doing that might be responses of don't hurt me or pushbacks. So again, we understand what are our experiences. What Ruth said, understanding this person's story historically helps us to target, educate shame, create oxytocin, so I'm still able to create a window tolerance of buffer. So the rejection will always be there, but then it all comes back down to interpersonal effectiveness or compatibility. Are the people I'm going to be around compatible for me? So that I'm able to kind of create, because sometimes the environment is toxic. Sometimes the person is a problem. Again, so therefore we need to learn, how am I going to regulate that? Because if I can't get rid of that person or problem solve that person, I need to work extra harder with force with that person. Right?
Yeah.
Can I just add to that, Vic, a sec? Because that's great. And I think one of the things that I have brought in is with the rejection dysphoria is to try and again look at the historical roots of this and normalize it, because actually the rejection dysphoria is a very, very exaggerated, obviously with ADHD, but it's got a really good survivalist root, which is if we were rejected from the tribe or the pack, we wouldn't survive. We knew being alone, we would not survive. So it's hardwired into our primitive nervous system that we need to belong. And so it's a really important part of existing in society, that we need others to survive. We're born wired to connect. And so if we can sort of normalize that actually this is just an extra difficult response, exaggerated, but actually it's a really important tool to survive in the world, is to belong.
Yeah. So kind of a reframing. It's kind of like, just to finish up what David was saying around the words creating worlds, you know, the stories we tell ourselves are so powerful, it sounds like. Which is, you know, where both obviously the therapy and the coaching very much come in to help ADHDers get a bit clearer about the stories they're telling themselves, and then giving them the skills, right, to be able to even access, you know, ask themselves, what story am I telling themselves, rather than just reacting, losing it, destroying relationships, unfortunately, making rash, impulsive decisions in the moment. So really empowering them.
And telling a story that I will be proud of. So it's encouraging every human to tell a story, but a story that I will be proud of, with a clear consciousness when I put my head on my pillow. Yeah, so Marsha's endings of her one-liner is a life worth living, you know? So definitely what you said, creating a world, but a world that I will be proud of. And that requires level of what Ruth said before, like accepting limits and responding to limits, learning to kind of realize, like, not, you know, pro-socialness of envy, but, you know, so definitely I'm in line with that, but definitely adding on a life that I will be proud of.
Yeah. So important, isn't it? And I guess, and what David was saying as well about knowing yourself first, in terms of, well, what is that life? What does that look like? Yeah. And again, and that's where coaching as well very much comes to the fore too, helping ADHDers understand exactly who they are, what their values are, and kind of creating their visions and goals, and helping them get there. So very much that kind of multidisciplinary approach. It takes a village to raise a child with ADHD, no less help an adult with ADHD navigate life as well and be their best selves, because like you said, the life that they're proud of, you know, ADHDs have some great potential, and yeah, it's such a shame that these challenges get in the way. So yeah, it's about getting the support that you need, and kind of really believing that you deserve the support, the best support possible.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, guys, thank you so much. So yes, thank you, Vic, and thank you, Ruth. That was really, really helpful, and hopefully participants, that kind of really help give you a bit of a lens on how therapy as well can support ADHDers together with coaching.